That's not a mother. That's a charity case in a Walmart dress. The words echoed across the country club terrace, and I watched 200 faces turn toward me like sunflowers seeking something to witness. My son's fiancée's mother, Carol Whitmore, stood beside the champagne fountain with her hand dramatically pressed to her chest, as if she'd just discovered something shocking rather than deliberately orchestrated this moment for maximum impact. What Carol didn't know was that the Walmart dress she was mocking had cost more than her monthly car payment. But I'd removed the designer label, just like I'd removed most evidence of who I really was for the past 35 years. Let me back up. My name is Linda Morrison, and I'm 62 years old. To most people, I'm a retired elementary school teacher who drives a 15-year-old Honda Civic and clips coupons. My son James thinks I live on my teacher's pension and the small life insurance policy his father left when he passed 12 years ago. The house I live in is the same modest 3-bedroom ranch we bought in 1988, in a neighborhood where people still leave their doors unlocked and know their neighbors' names. What James doesn't know is that I'm L.M. Morrison, author of 17 best-selling mystery novels. The first one, written during his nap time when he was 2 years old, sold to a publisher for $5,000. By the time James was in middle school, my advance had climbed to $500,000 per book. Today, with foreign rights, film options, and 30 years of compound interest, my net worth sits comfortably at 8 figures. I never told him. I never told anyone, except my late husband Tom and my agent Patricia. Tom understood why immediately. He'd seen what money did to his own family, the way his siblings fought over their parents' estate like dogs over a bone. We agreed our son would grow up understanding the value of work, of earning what you have, of building character before building wealth. James turned out exactly as we'd hoped. He's kind, humble, works hard at his marketing job, lives in a modest apartment, and saves carefully for the things he wants. He met Amanda Whitmore 2 years ago at a professional conference, and she seemed perfect for him. Smart, driven, a successful corporate attorney with her own accomplishments. Then I met her family. The Whitmores were what Tom used to call mansion rich, the kind of wealthy where the money is new enough that they need everyone to know about it. Carol Whitmore, Amanda's mother, owned a successful real estate development company. Her husband, Richard, had made his fortune in tech startups. They lived in a gated community where the houses looked like hotels and the cars in the driveways cost more than college educations. The first time I met Carol was at Amanda and James's apartment for dinner. She'd swept in wearing head-to-toe designer labels, each piece carefully selected to communicate exactly how much she could afford to spend on a casual Tuesday evening. Her eyes had taken in my department store slacks and clearance rack blouse with the kind of quick, dismissive scan you'd give to furniture you were about to throw away. "So you're a teacher," she'd said, making the profession sound like I'd admitted to being unemployed. How quaint. Throughout dinner, she'd peppered me with questions clearly designed to establish the gulf between our economic situations. Where did I vacation? Did I have a vacation? I didn't. Was I planning to upgrade my car soon? Not unless the Honda finally died. Had I been able to save much for retirement? Oh, I was getting by. Each answer seemed to satisfy her a little more, like she was checking boxes on some invisible form. Her son's fiancée's mother, confirmed inferior, no threat, no competition, can be safely pitied and patronized. I'd smiled through it all. I'd been doing this for 35 years. I could certainly handle Carol Whitmore. The engagement party was Carol's idea, of course. She'd insisted on hosting it at her country club, insisted on inviting 200 of her closest friends and business associates, insisted on planning every detail herself. When James had gently suggested that perhaps I could contribute or help plan, Carol had laughed. "Oh, James, that's so sweet. But this kind of event requires a certain level of expertise. And expense," she'd added, with a pointed look at me. "Please don't worry your mother about the costs. I know every penny counts on a teacher's pension." James had looked uncomfortable, but he hadn't pushed back. He'd been raised to be respectful of his elders, even when they were being condescending. Amanda had simply smiled and squeezed his hand, and I'd watched my son convince himself that her mother's rudeness was just her way of showing love. The party itself was everything Carol had promised: elegant, expensive, and designed to impress. The country club's terrace had been transformed into something out of a wedding magazine, with thousands of white roses, crystal everything, and enough champagne to float a small boat. Carol had hired a photographer, a live band, and caterers who'd trained at Michelin-starred restaurants. She'd also, I noticed, seated me at a table in the back corner, far from the main action, with people I'd never met. When I'd arrived in my simple navy dress, Armani, but with the label removed, Carol's eyes had swept over me with barely concealed satisfaction. "Linda," she'd said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear, "I'm so glad you could make it. I know events like this can be a bit overwhelming when you're not used to them." I'd smiled. "It's lovely, Carol. You've done a beautiful job. Well, when you have the resources, you want to give your children the best." She'd placed a territorial hand on Amanda's shoulder. "Not everyone can provide that, and that's okay. Different circumstances, different possibilities." The party had proceeded smoothly for the first hour. I'd made small talk with the strangers at my table, watched James and Amanda make their rounds greeting guests, and genuinely enjoyed the chocolate-covered strawberries that were indeed excellent. Carol had stationed herself near the center of the terrace, holding court, clearly the star of her own show. Then came the toasts. Richard Whitmore went first, welcoming James to the family with the kind of speech that managed to sound generous while subtly emphasizing how much they were bringing to the relationship. Several of their friends followed, sharing stories about Amanda's accomplishments, her law school successes, her career achievements. James had stood then, wanting to say a few words about his mother, about the woman who'd raised him alone after his father died, who'd worked 2 jobs some years to make sure he could go to college, who'd taught him everything he knew about being a good person. He'd barely gotten 3 sentences in when Carol had interrupted. "James, that's so sweet," she'd said, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet terrace. "It's wonderful that you appreciate your mother's sacrifices. We all admire teachers, truly. They do such important work for such modest compensation." She'd paused, and I'd felt the shift in the air, the way you feel a storm coming before the first raindrop falls. "But I think it's important, as we celebrate this union of our families, to be realistic about what each side brings to the table. Amanda has been blessed with opportunities, with resources, with the kind of life that creates success. And you, James, have done remarkably well considering your circumstances. Your mother should be very proud that despite her limitations, she raised a son who could attract a woman of Amanda's caliber." The silence that followed was the kind you could feel in your chest. James's face had gone very still. "Her limitations?" he'd repeated quietly. Carol had smiled, misreading his tone as invitation to continue. "Well, I just mean economically speaking. Let's be honest, Linda has done her best, but there's only so much a woman in her position can provide. Teaching is noble, but it's not exactly lucrative. I admire her thriftiness, truly. That dress she's wearing right now, I'm sure she's worn it to a dozen occasions, gotten excellent cost per wear out of it." A few people had laughed nervously. Carol had taken that as encouragement. I remember when Amanda first told us about James, one of my first thoughts was, well, at least one of them won't be burdened by student loans. More laughter. But seriously, I think it's important as we move forward to understand that the Whitmores will naturally be providing most of the financial support for this marriage. The wedding, the house down payment, the lifestyle they'll be accustomed to, and that's fine. Not everyone can contribute equally. She'd turned to look directly at me then, her smile sharp as glass. "That's not a mother. That's a charity case in a Walmart dress." I'd expected James to be upset. What I hadn't expected was the way he'd moved. He'd set down his champagne glass very carefully, walked across the terrace to where his mother sat, and extended his hand to me. "Mom," he'd said, his voice level but carrying across the silent crowd. "We're leaving." James, Amanda had started, but he'd held up his other hand. "No. I've sat here for an hour listening to your mother make subtle digs at my mom. I've watched her place her at the worst table, introduce her to people as just a teacher, and imply that she's somehow less than. But that," he'd pointed at Carol, "that crosses a line I will not allow anyone to cross." "James, I didn't mean..." Carol had begun, But James had cut her off. You meant exactly what you said. You've made it clear from day one that you think your money makes you better than us. That because my mom drives an old car and wears simple clothes and lives in a modest house, she's less valuable as a person. He'd turned to Amanda then, and I'd seen something in his face that broke my heart. Amanda, I love you. But I need you to decide right now if you're going to stand there silent while your mother insults mine, or if you're going to be the woman I thought you were. Amanda had looked between her mother and James, her face pale. James, she didn't mean it that way. She's just trying to be practical about our future. Practical. James had repeated the word like it tasted bitter. Your mother just called my mom a charity case in front of 200 people, and you think that's practical? Well, Amanda had said, and I'd heard the tiny hint of her mother's condescension creeping into her voice. We do need to be realistic about the financial dynamics of our marriage. My family has resources that will make our life easier, and if your mom can't contribute at the same level, that's just a fact we need to acknowledge. James had looked at her for a long moment. Then he'd slipped the engagement ring off his finger and placed it on the nearest table. Then I guess we don't have a marriage to plan. The gasps that had rippled through the crowd were like wind through grass. Carol's face had gone from triumphant to shocked in seconds. James, don't be ridiculous, she'd snapped. You're throwing away your future over some hurt feelings? I'm protecting my future, James had said. I don't want to spend my life with people who measure human value in dollars. Mom, let's go. I'd stood, took my son's arm, and walked through 200 silent guests toward the exit. Behind us, I could hear Carol sputtering, Amanda calling James's name, Richard trying to calm everyone down. We'd gotten to my Honda in the parking lot before James had finally broken down. He'd leaned against the car and put his face in his hands. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry you had to hear that, James. I'd said gently. You have nothing to apologize for. I knew she was snobby, but I thought Amanda was different. I thought she saw past all that. He'd looked up at me, his eyes red. Did I just make a huge mistake? No, sweetheart. You made the right choice. If she couldn't stand up for you when it mattered, if she values her mother's money more than your relationship, then better to find out now. But I love her. I know, and that's going to hurt for a while. We'd driven home in silence, and I'd made him tea while he sat at my kitchen table, the same one where he'd done his homework as a kid, looking lost and heartbroken. It was then that I'd made a decision. I'd kept my secret for 35 years. But my son needed to know that his mother wasn't what Carol Whitmore thought she was. Not for my pride, but for his understanding of what had just happened. James, I'd said, sitting down across from him. There's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you a long time ago. And I'd explained everything. The books, the pen name, the decades of bestsellers, the careful investments, the reason for the secrecy. I'd shown him my royalty statements, my investment portfolios. The financial documents that proved his charity case mother could have bought Carol Whitmore's country club membership 100 times over. He'd stared at the papers, then at me, then back at the papers. You're Ella Morrison, he'd said slowly. You wrote the Catherine Blake mysteries. I've read every single one. Amanda has read every single one. Carol has 3 of them on her bookshelf. Yes, and you never told me because I wanted you to grow up understanding the value of work, of character, of earning what you have. Money doesn't make you better than anyone else, James. It's just a tool. How you treat people, how you handle yourself, who you are when no one's watching, that's what matters. He'd been quiet for a long time. Then, does this mean you could have helped me with my student loans? I paid them off 3 years ago, anonymously, through a scholarship foundation I set up. The apartment I thought I couldn't afford in the better neighborhood, but then found out the landlord was offering a discount. My building. I own it. The job promotion I got last year, that seemed to come out of nowhere? Your own merit. I don't own your company, and I wouldn't interfere in your career. You earned that yourself. James had started laughing, then crying, then laughing again. Carol Whitmore just called a multi-millionaire best-selling author a charity case because you shop at Target. I still think Target has excellent value for basic necessities. Mom. He'd grabbed my hands. Why are you telling me this now? Because you need to understand that what happened tonight wasn't about money or status or who can provide what. It was about respect, about character. Carol Whitmore could have been kind, but she chose cruelty. Amanda could have defended you, but she chose her mother's approval. And you chose integrity over comfort. I chose you. You chose right and wrong. That's what your father and I raised you to do. We'd sat there in my modest kitchen, in my modest house, surrounded by the modest life I deliberately built, and I'd felt proud of my son in a way that had nothing to do with money or success or any of the things Carol valued. The next 3 days were quiet. James took time off work, stayed at my house, processed what had happened. Amanda called repeatedly, but he didn't answer. Carol sent a tears email saying she hoped James would come to his senses and stop being so emotional. Then, on the 4th day, something interesting happened. The local newspaper ran a story about charitable giving in our community. It was an annual piece they did, highlighting major donors to various causes. This year, they'd finally convinced the anonymous donor who'd been funding the new children's wing at the hospital, the scholarship program at the community college, and the renovation of the public library to reveal her identity. The photo was of me, standing in front of the library, with a headline that read, "Local Teacher's Secret Second Life as Best-Selling Author Benefits Entire Community." The article detailed my decades-long writing career, my decision to use a pen name to maintain privacy, and my years of quiet philanthropy. It mentioned the total amount I donated over the years, just over $4 million. My phone started ringing within an hour. Friends, former colleagues, neighbors I'd known for decades. Everyone was shocked, supportive, curious. I did one interview with the local paper's reporter, a lovely young woman who understood that I didn't want the attention, but felt the community deserved to know where the help had been coming from. By the evening, the story had been picked up regionally. By the next morning, nationally. Modest Teacher's Secret Millions made for good clickbait, apparently. James had found it simultaneously hilarious and anxiety-inducing. "Mom, you're trending on Twitter. Is that good? For book sales, probably yes. For maintaining your quiet life, probably no." He'd been right about the book sales. My publisher called to say that all 17 of my backlist titles had suddenly shot up the bestseller lists again. Patricia, my agent, was fielding interview requests from major news outlets. Hollywood producers who'd let their options on my books lapse were suddenly calling back. But the call that mattered most came on day 6, after the engagement party. It was Carol Whitmore. "Linda," she'd said, her voice tight, "I think we need to talk." "I don't think we do, Carol. Please. Just give me 10 minutes. In person." Something in her voice made me agree. We met at a coffee shop near my house. Neutral territory. Carol looked different than she had at the party. Smaller, somehow, less polished. She'd ordered a black coffee and hadn't touched it. "I owe you an apology," she'd said. Obviously. I judged you. I'm not going to make excuses. I saw your car, your clothes, your house, and I made assumptions about who you were and what you were worth. As a person, yes, you did. She'd winced. I was raised to believe that success was visible, that if you had money, you showed it. My parents grew up poor, and they spent their entire lives building wealth and displaying it so that everyone would know they'd made it. I internalized that. I thought appearances were everything. Carol, I appreciate the apology. But I'm not done. She'd taken a breath. The night of the party, after you and James left, do you know what happened? My friends, the people I'd invited, spent the rest of the evening talking about what I'd said, about how cruel it was, about how they'd always thought I was a bit much, but that night I'd crossed a line. 3 of my board members told me they were reconsidering their positions. 5 of my biggest clients called this week to say they'd be taking their business elsewhere. I'm sorry that happened to you. Don't be. I earned it. And then the article came out, and I realized that not only had I insulted a genuinely good person, but I'd done it in the most publicly humiliating way possible. And the worst part? Her eyes had filled with tears. The absolute worst part is that I raised my daughter to think like me, to value the wrong things. And because of that, she's lost a man who truly loved her. What do you want from me, Carol? Nothing. I don't want anything. I'm here because I owe you a sincere apology, not the kind I'd give to save my business or my reputation, but the kind I'd give because I genuinely understand that I was wrong. You spent 35 years quietly making the world better, while I spent 35 years loudly showing off my money. You raised a son with integrity, while I raised a daughter who stood silent while I bullied his mother. You are exactly the kind of woman I should have aspired to be, and instead, I mocked you. We'd sat in silence for a moment. I accept your apology, I'd said finally. Not because it changes what happened, but because it takes courage to admit when you're wrong. Is there any chance? Do you think James might give Amanda another opportunity? That's not my decision to make. That's between them. But if it were your decision, I'd thought about it carefully. If Amanda came to James and showed him that she'd genuinely learned something, that she understood why what happened was wrong, that she was willing to stand up to you, and everyone else who measures worth by wealth, maybe. But it would have to come from her, Carol, not from you coaching her on what to say. Carol had nodded, stood, and extended her hand. I'd shaken it. For what it's worth, she'd said, I'm a huge fan of your books. The irony that I've spent hundreds of dollars buying them over the years isn't lost on me. I appreciate readers wherever they come from. She'd smiled weakly and left. 2 weeks later, Amanda had shown up at my door. Not at James's apartment. At my door. She'd asked if we could talk, just the two of us. We'd sat in my backyard, in the same lawn chairs I'd had for 20 years, drinking iced tea. I've spent the last 2 weeks in therapy, she'd said. Intensive therapy, working through why I reacted the way I did, why I couldn't stand up to my mother, why I let her behavior slide for so long. And what did you discover? That I'm more like her than I wanted to admit. That I've spent my whole life equating money with worth. That I looked at your house and your car and made the same judgments she did. I was just politer about it. She'd paused. And that I lost the best man I've ever known because I cared more about appearances than integrity. Why are you telling me this and not James? Because you're the one I need to apologize to. James knows I'm sorry. I've apologized to him a dozen times, but you're the one I stood there and watched be humiliated, and I said nothing. You're the one I let my mother disrespect, and I defended her actions. You're the one I owe the real apology to. I'd looked at this young woman, polished and educated and successful, breaking down in my backyard, and I'd seen something genuine there. I forgive you, Amanda. But you need to understand something. If you and James do find your way back to each other, you're going to have to be prepared to stand up to your mother, not just once, but whenever it's necessary. Can you do that? I already have. I told her that if she can't treat James and his family with respect, she won't be part of my life. It's been hard. She's my mother. But I meant it. And James? What do you want from him? A second chance, a fresh start, an opportunity to show him that I'm not the woman I was at that party. She'd looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. But I'll understand if he can't give me that. I'll understand if I've broken something that can't be fixed. I'd made her tea, my answer to everything, and we'd talked for 2 more hours. About her childhood, about the pressure she'd felt to maintain her family's image, about the therapy she was committing to, about the changes she was trying to make. By the end, I'd believed her. Not that she was perfect, but that she was genuinely trying. I can't promise you anything with James, I'd said as she was leaving. That's his decision. But I can tell you that I believe you're sincere, and I can tell you that second chances are worth giving when someone's earned them. She'd hugged me then, this woman who'd stood silent while her mother called me a charity case, and I'd felt her shaking with tears. I didn't tell James about the conversation. That wasn't my place. But 3 days later, he told me he was meeting Amanda for coffee. A week after that, they were talking regularly. A month after that, he'd asked me what I thought about the idea of trying again. Do you love her? I'd asked. Yes. Does she understand why what happened was wrong? Yes. Completely. Do you trust her to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard? He'd thought about that for a long moment. I think so. I think she's learning. I think that night was a wake-up call. Then that's your answer. It's been 6 months now since the engagement party. James and Amanda are taking things slowly, rebuilding trust, working through the damage that was done. Carol and I have an uneasy peace. She's respectful now, almost overly so, and I can see her trying to be different. Richard has been quietly kind throughout, and I've come to like him. The story died down eventually, as stories do. I gave a few more interviews, did a book tour that I'd been avoiding for 20 years, and donated the proceeds to local charities. My neighbors still wave when I drive by in my Honda. I still clip coupons, not because I need to, but because old habits die hard and waste is waste regardless of your bank balance. James and I have dinner every Sunday, just like always. Sometimes Amanda joins us now. Sometimes Carol and Richard come too, and those dinners are occasionally awkward, but they're getting easier. Learning to respect each other across class lines, real or perceived, takes work. Last week, James had shown up with a small box. Inside was a simple silver necklace with a charm that read, "Worth." "It's not about money," he'd said. "It's a reminder of what you taught me. That our worth comes from who we are, not what we have." I wear it every day now, over my Target t-shirts and my unlabeled designer dresses alike. Sometimes I think about that night at the country club, about Carol's cruel words echoing across the terrace, about the choice James made to walk away from a woman he loved, rather than tolerate disrespect toward his mother, about Amanda's choice to stand silent, and her harder choice later to admit she was wrong. Money amplifies who you already are. If you're kind, it gives you opportunities to be kinder. If you're cruel, it gives you a bigger platform for cruelty. But it doesn't make you better or worse. It's just a tool. I'm 62 years old. I've written 17 best-selling novels that millions of people have read. I've donated millions to my community. I've raised a son who values integrity over comfort. And yes, I was once called a charity case in a Walmart dress by a woman who didn't know any better. But I'm still here, still driving my Honda, still living in my modest house, still clipping coupons, still writing my books, still being exactly who I've always been. Because at the end of the day, the only worth that matters is the worth you assign to yourself, and I've always known exactly what I'm worth.